The sword's blow came with terrifying swiftness, but death was not immediate. For nearly half a minute, Solara's eyes continued to blink, her consciousness trapped in the severed head, aware in a way that no human should ever endure. She saw the gray dawn over Newbridge, heard the wet, intimate sounds of her own blood soaking into the wooden platform and straw beneath her, and felt every heartbeat linger despite her body's betrayal. Yet even this physiological horror was nothing compared to what had already been done to her. The carefully polished story of Celara Devaine's execution as a dignified queen-to-be was a lie maintained for generations. Her fate was not justice. It was a spectacle of humiliation, deliberately designed, methodically staged so that the blade became a release rather than a punishment. If you are drawn to the hidden horrors of history, subscribe. This is not a legend or a romanticized tragedy. It is the slow dismantling of a young woman the world had chosen to erase. Before the screams, before the steel kiss her neck, Celara was just a girl, frightened, isolated, and condemned before the law of man had even touched her. Her execution stands as one of the clearest examples of absolute power wielded sadistically, where death was merely the punctuation at the end of a long campaign of psychological destruction. Most history books reduce her life to a single line, executed for treason. But the reality of her final days reveals a dismantling so meticulous it would be recognizable to modern interrogators. Solara's death was the final act in King Reginald Ivy's campaign to obliterate a woman who had become inconveniently powerful, and the targeting began long before the scaffold was built. By the spring of 1541, she had already endured 3 weeks in the Iron Keep, the same fortress where she had once prepared for a coronation as the future Queen of Avalon. Just 3 years prior, she had walked these halls in anticipation of the crown, draped in velvet and gold, ready to ascend amidst celebration. Now she waited for death, trapped in the same walls, suspended in a cruel limbo that stretched endlessly. The execution date was announced, then withdrawn, then announced again. This was no mistake. It was deliberate torment. By stretching the uncertainty, Reginald forced Celara to live inside her own execution, rehearsing in her mind endlessly. Each dawn asked the same question. Is this the day they take me? Each night ended without answer. Even this was not the worst part. The king had summoned a highly skilled swordsman from Valencrest, bypassing the traditional acts of their land. Some framed this as mercy, but it was anything but. The imported blade transformed Solara's execution into theater, a performance engineered for precision, spectacle, and psychological domination. Even in death, she would belong not to her people, but entirely to the king. Witnesses describe Celara in her final hours as possessing an eerie, almost supernatural calm. Some claim she joked and laughed, masking a complete mental collapse with dark humor. Modern psychology identifies this as dissociation, a mind detaching itself when survival feels impossible. What appears as courage is often the last defense of the psyche. Few accounts pause to consider the sheer terror she endured, not just fear of death, but of annihilation. She knew her reputation was being systematically dismantled through fabricated accusations of adultery, conspiracy, and treason, charges so implausible that no fair tribunal would accept them today. Yet this was precisely the point. This was not about truth. It was about erasure. King Reginald did not merely want Celara dead. He wanted her history obliterated, her influence nullified, her heirs delegitimized. The execution was not the punishment. It was a justification. In the weeks leading up to her death, she was forced to endure grotesque tales of her supposed sexual depravity, repeated until even she doubted her own reality. The morning of April 13th dawned unnaturally clear over Newbridge, a cruel contrast to the horrors awaiting Celara. She had spent the night in prayer, clutching ritual as her only remaining certainty. Sleep evaded her entirely. Records from the keep show that at 2 a.m. she requested the sacrament and remained kneeling for hours, praying to anything that might offer protection. By dawn, she had been awake for nearly 24 hours, trembling between hope and despair. Her body was exhausted, her mind fractured. When the keep lieutenant arrived to escort her, Celera was reportedly laughing quietly with her ladies-in-waiting. This was not calm, it was collapse. Her execution had been scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, and delayed repeatedly. An often overlooked but devastating form of torture, uncertainty. Not knowing when death would come, each moment stretched into a torment of anticipation. Only when the hour had finally arrived was Celera informed. She was led from her chambers through corridors she had once walked as a future queen, her steps silent. Courtiers bowed as she passed, not in respect, but from habit and fear. Guards flanked her to prevent escape, and the same courtiers who had once depended on her favor watched in cold silence. Indifference had replaced loyalty. The scaffold on crimson green was unusually low, barely 90 centimeters. Unlike the elevated platforms often depicted in plays and paintings, this forced Celera to climb only a few shallow steps. This was intentional. It denied her symbolic elevation, dignity, and distance from the crowd. She was to face her subjects eye to eye, making the spectacle intimate and humiliating. Contemporary accounts suggest the crowd was treated to a carnival-like atmosphere, encouraged by the king's advisors. This was theater, a warning to anyone, especially women, who might dare overstep the boundaries of power. Celera was allowed a final speech before kneeling, not out of mercy, but because tradition demanded it. She spoke carefully. "Good people of Eurasia, I am come hither to die according to law." This controlled statement was her final act of defiance. By acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, she subtly exposed the illegitimacy of the charges. She would die obedient but unconfessed. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the king's absence. Unlike other royal executions, King Reginald did not attend. Instead, he remained at Whitehall Keep, awaiting confirmation of her death, even as preparations proceeded for his next political marriage. Celera's death had become logistical. The person was now entirely political. The swordsman brought from Vale and Crest, carefully selected and lavishly paid, represented another layer of calculated cruelty. Local executions relied on an axe, messy, imprecise, sometimes requiring multiple blows. The foreign swordsman ensured efficiency. Celera would die not at the hands of her countrymen, but a stranger, intensifying her displacement and isolation. Her blindfold, often portrayed as an act of mercy, was practical. It prevented flinching. She knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, following a custom designed to make the execution more difficult. She had to remain perfectly still by sheer will. Witnesses describe her lips moving constantly in prayer, eyes darting beneath the blindfold, straining for any hint of the approaching blow. Death was coming, she just did not know when. And then it came. The decapitation, by all accounts, was flawless. One single, expert stroke of the sword severed Celera's head cleanly, but that was only the beginning. According to eyewitnesses, her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation. Not metaphorically, physically. Residual oxygen in the brain allowed brief, involuntary movements, and some witnesses claimed her lips seemed to form words, perhaps the final syllables of a prayer interrupted by the blade. For those observing, the effect was deeply unsettling. Some fainted. Others turned away in visible distress. The boundary between life and death had blurred, exposing the raw, unfinished nature dying in a way few present would forget. Yet the cruelty did not end. No coffin awaited Celera's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, still shaking and grieving, were forced to scramble in confusion to find anything suitable. Eventually, they settled on a wooden chest used for storing armaments. Into it, Celera's severed head and body were placed together. This was no oversight. Even in death, she was treated not as a human being deserving dignity, but as a political inconvenience, a problem resolved and discarded. She was hastily buried beneath the chapel floor of the keep, without proper ceremony, as though those responsible wished her memory to vanish as quickly as her life had ended. But the campaign to erase Celera did not end with her death. King Reginald and his advisors ensured that her name, her deeds, and her legacy would be systematically removed from the annals of history. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Royal insignia bearing Solara's symbols were torn from walls and tapestries. Courtiers quickly learned that speaking her name or defending her was now dangerous. Silence became survival. While popular history often emphasizes the physical act of beheading, the systematic erasure of Solara's existence represents a deeper cruelty, the execution of a legacy. Not just a body removed, but a memory obliterated. It would take centuries for historians to reconstruct her life from scattered records that survived the purge, letters saved by chance, fragments that escaped destruction. But the damage was nearly total, and the trauma did not end with her death. Solara's execution left a psychological scar on all who witnessed it. Her ladies-in-waiting, already terrified of association with the Queen's alleged crimes, were ordered to clean and prepare her severed head before burial. They did so under strict supervision, knowing that a careless word or visible grief could mark them as complicit. Several reportedly suffered persistent nightmares for years. At least one withdrew entirely from court life, entering a convent, unable to remain in an environment that demanded obedience to horror. The psychological aftershocks rippled outward, poisoning the atmosphere of King Reginald's court. Fear replaced loyalty. Self-preservation replaced honesty. No one felt safe, and perhaps nowhere was that cruelty more evident than in the fate of Solara's child. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, her daughter, less than 3 years old, was formally declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, and stripped of status. The child who might one day wield influence or inherit power was, for a time, effectively erased alongside her mother. Court records show her household dissolved almost overnight. She was left without proper clothing, attendance, or recognition befitting her birth. Her mother was executed, and her father publicly denied her legitimacy. This was punishment extended by proxy. Most modern dramatizations fail to capture the full sensory violence of Tudor-style executions. The scaffold bore the stains of old blood, thick in the warming spring air. Flies hovered constantly. The noise was overwhelming. The crowd, seated with instructed supporters, produced a wall of sound designed to intimidate and disorient. Jeers, insults, and accusations of witchcraft and adultery filled the space. This was not spontaneous. It was organized. Public humiliation was central. Death alone was insufficient. The execution was meant to linger in memory as a warning. Popular culture often portrays Solara's final speech as serene defiance. The reality is far more constrained and tragic. Her words were carefully chosen, shaped by fear for her child and awareness that everything she said would be reported to King. Even at the point of death, she could not speak freely. Her statement acknowledging Reginald as a just ruler reflects constraint, not submission. This was final censorship. The words of a woman for whom truth itself had become too dangerous to voice. The sword that ended her life, specifically imported from VIII Crest, embodied performative nature of the execution. Reginald spared no expense to stage a death worthy of a fallen queen. The executioner practiced beforehand, perfecting the single blow that justified his high fee. Professionalism over compassion, efficiency over humanity. Solara was not merely killed. She was processed. State-sanctioned execution transformed her suffering into a precise message, delivered with cold, calculated perfection. Contemporary accounts note that no local executioner would take the task, not out of moral hesitation, but because the technique required specialized training. The VIII Crest sword differed from the traditional axe. Lighter, razor-sharp, designed for a swift horizontal strike rather than a downward chop. Even the mechanics of death were carefully chosen for aesthetics. After the sword fell, witness Thomas Whitfield, a poet imprisoned in the keep and forced to watch the execution of a woman he had once admired, wrote later the small throat that had once been adorned with jewels. That single line captures Solara's grotesque transformation from adorned queen to displayed corpse. The executioner lifted her severed head by the hair, a customary gesture intended to demonstrate that the sentence had been carried out. Blood continued to flow as the crowd witnessed the final proof. The raised head, the still warm body, burned itself into memory. It was the execution's final act. No marker was placed above her, no inscription. For centuries, her exact burial site remained unknown. This absence was deliberate. The removal of even her resting place marked the final stage of King Reginald's campaign, not merely to kill Salera, but to excise her from history itself. And, alarmingly, it almost succeeded. In the days following the execution, royal propagandists moved quickly. Poets who once praised Salara's intelligence now produced verses condemning her as corrupt and immoral. Official records emphasized the king's supposed mercy in providing a skilled swordsman. The spectacle was reframed as an act of kindness. The horror was quietly edited out. This process of sanitization began almost immediately, laying the foundation for centuries of historical distortion. Perhaps most disturbing to modern eyes is how quickly life returned to the court. The very next day after Salara's execution, Reginald was formally betrothed to Lady Maris Vane. Life moved on. The problem had been solved. Within 2 weeks of sending his second queen to the scaffold, the king married his third in a quiet ceremony at the palace. The speed was not romantic. It was administrative. This brutal efficiency revealed Salara's execution for what it truly was. Not an emotional rupture, but a political solution. She had failed to produce a surviving male heir. Therefore, she was removed and replaced. Her death was not mourned. It was processed. The personal tragedy of Salara's execution was fully subordinated to mechanics of rule and dynastic continuity. For Reginald, her life ended the moment she ceased to be useful. And even then, this was not the worst. The psychological dimension of Salara's execution extended far beyond the scaffold. For weeks before her death, she endured relentless interrogations, was denied consistent sleep, and deliberately isolated from allies. She was kept uncertain, disoriented, and emotionally unmoored. Sir Thomas Corvin, the king's chief minister and architect of the charges, employed tactics strikingly similar to modern psychological torture: disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the strategic presentation of false information as undeniable truth. By the time Salera reached the scaffold, the goal was not simply to execute her body. It was to ensure her spirit had already been broken. This was not a trial. It was a campaign of mental collapse, and it succeeded. On execution day, she no longer resisted, protested, or destabilized the narrative. That was the objective from the start. Court records reveal that security measures for Salara's execution were extraordinary, even by Tudor standards. The fortress garrison was doubled. Additional guards were stationed throughout the palace complex. These precautions were not intended to prevent escape. They never feared that. They ensured no allies could intervene, no sympathetic nobles could rally support. The overwhelming show of force served a second purpose: intimidation. Anyone who still felt sympathy for Salera was reminded visibly and unmistakably that silence was survival. Loyalty was no longer enough. Submission was required. The execution itself was scheduled for mid-morning rather than dawn. The timing mattered. A later hour allowed more witnesses, though only a limited audience of nobles and officials could enter the courtyard. Towering walls ensured that crowds gathered outside. When the sword fell, church bells across the city tolled. London itself was made to participate. Salara's death was not private punishment. It was civic ritual. State power announced itself through sound, repetition, and spectacle. Her execution became political theater. Death was not the point. Demonstration was. Among the most overlooked aspects of Salara's demise is the fate of her alleged accomplices. 5 men, including her own brother, Gervase Boleyn, were executed just days prior. Their deaths served a crucial function. By killing them first, the Crown established proof of Salara's guilt before she ever reached the scaffold. Any final statement she made could be dismissed as the protest of a condemned conspirator. This sequencing was deliberate, eliminating the possibility of contradiction. 6 people were removed under nearly identical charges, supported by fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. This was not justice gone awry. It was engineered justice, a coordinated purge, one of the clearest examples of state violence in Tudor-era England, comparable not in scale, but in structure to modern show trials. The courtyard of Blackthorn Keep now features a modest plaque marking the approximate location of Solara's execution. Yet contemporary records indicate the actual scaffold stood elsewhere within the fortress complex. This geographical uncertainty is symbolic. Solara's death has been repeatedly relocated, both physically and historically, to fit later narratives, softened, reframed, made palatable. The romanticized version in popular accounts bears almost no resemblance to the psychological warfare that defined her final days. What happened to Solara was not misfortune. It was calculated removal. The horror of her execution does not reside solely in the moment the sword fell. It lies in the process that led there. This was not simply a death. It was a culmination of a sustained campaign to destroy a woman who had risen too high for the comfort of King Reginald's court. Solara was not merely killed. She was systematically undone, her reputation dismantled, her achievements invalidated, her lineage threatened, her very existence treated as an error to be corrected. When we examine the full context, psychological torture, public humiliation, narrative manipulation, and historical erasure, we encounter something far more disturbing than a swift execution. From a modern psychological perspective, Solara's death is a textbook example of state-sanctioned gaslighting and reputational assassination. The accusations of adultery with multiple courtiers, incestuous plots, and schemes against the king were so implausible they collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. Yet they were accepted. Why? Because power controls reality when it controls repetition. Through coerced confessions, controlled information channels, and the elimination of dissenting voices, the court persuaded much of the realm that Solara deserved to die. Truth became irrelevant. Belief was manufactured. This manipulation of collective perception may be the most terrifying aspect of her death. Centuries later, Solara's execution continues to fascinate because it sits at the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculation. Her death was not merely the end of her life. It was a performance designed to justify royal action and permanently rewrite memory. This is not ancient history. It is a recurring pattern. Solara's ultimate tragedy may be that despite every effort to erase her, it was her death, not her life, that became her most enduring legacy. By confronting the full reality of her execution, stripped of romance and sanitized myth, we expose uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and historical storytelling. The familiar tale of a disgraced noble woman meeting a swift, dignified end conceals something far darker. State power abusing narrative control to justify cruelty. By understanding the psychological machinery behind Solara's execution, how her reputation was dismantled, her voice silenced, her memory threatened, we gain insight into how authority maintains itself through control of bodies and stories. And in the image of Solara's severed head, momentarily conscious beneath the gray northern sky, we are left with one unmistakable warning. When power controls a story, even truth can be executed. If this account kept you engaged, drop a like and comment your country or city below. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and please subscribe to help this small channel grow. It means more than you know.